Today we're going to be replacing the radiator on a 2003 Mitsubishi Outlander XLS. Now the first generation Mitsubishi Outlanders tend to have a failure at the radiator around the same spot regardless of the year, whether it's anywhere from 03 to 06. Right here at the mating point where the metal of the radiator connects to the plastic, you're going to find that pretty much every Outlander is going to leak right around here. This foam portion is going to get doused in that coolant, and if you look through the hole where your hood latches to, you'll probably also notice a bunch of liquid has coated the outside of your radiator. But honestly, you look around and you'll find radiator fluid just about everywhere, and usually it's because it's leaking right around here. So it's time to replace the radiator because it can no longer handle the pressure that the system is under during operation. So we're going to go through about how to replace the radiator on this vehicle step by step. So first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery. Now the reason you want to disconnect the battery is because there's actually some sensors near the front of the vehicle that's located very close to the radiator that has to deal with the airbag system. Now, out of an abundance of caution, we just want to disconnect the negative battery terminal from the vehicle so that way we don't have power going to that sensor. That way, if for whatever reason we knock it and something weird happens, the airbag doesn't deploy. So first we're going to find ourselves a 10mm socket, and we're going to come over here. Make sure get this right here. And we're going to disconnect it. Now, here's the thing. Before working on any components that are electronic, keep the disconnected negative terminal off for a minimum of 90 seconds. And the reason you want to do that is because there are certain components within the vehicle that can retain electrical power for a short duration after the battery has been disconnected, particularly things with capacitors and such. So best practice is remove the terminal, wait 90 seconds before working on electronic connections, which we will, and then start working on anything that has an electrical connection. So the first thing we're going to want to do is take off the front portion of the air intake here, because as you can see, it covers the top of the radiator and it's going to be in the way. There's only two connections that hold it together. These are just plastic rivets. Because they're plastic rivets, they're kind of a bit of a pain to get out. Now you'll see that they are Phillips head connections here on the top. That being said, don't let that confuse you. They do not come out just by taking a Phillips head and twisting it around. So either get yourself a trim tool, a flathead screwdriver, or something of the like, because you're going to need to pry it out of its position. And if you have to reuse them, well, you're going to want to be gentle, but luckily you can get a lot of these plastic rivets on Amazon for relatively cheap. So you can continue to pry it up from the bottom with the flathead screwdriver, but if you have one of these trim tool kits, and this is specifically designed for things like plastic rivets, you can really get under there, get it at a good position, and maybe you might just save the component and it pops it out. Now that being said, you're likely going to break the plastic rivet like I just did. So there's a little hole in there, at least a piece of plastic. Now the other plastic rivets you find around the front are a bit different, and I find that using the flathead screwdriver to get under there first makes a big difference, because getting the proper plastic rivet remover underneath this piece is quite difficult, and using the Phillips head to try and do anything doesn't really yield any results, despite the fact that these do in fact have threads on them So it's just going to be one of those things. So because these things are just plastic rivets and they get old and brittle over time, mine just happen to break in place. Maybe you'll get lucky and be able to salvage them, but like any of these plastic rivets that you're going to be dealing with the front panels on this vehicle, just go on Amazon and get a bunch of them to replace. It's only a few dollars to get rid of them and replace them with some new ones. So now that we've got this free, you can see that it moves. We're going to take it off, and to do that, first we'll take this little connection right here, and we're going to move this to the side out of the way. Then we have to take this top portion off here. You'll see there's a flap that locks onto your air filter box, and it's on both sides. We're going to take this, move it out of the way. There is a rubber gasket that goes onto this. It sometimes gets stuck and sometimes falls into this box. Make sure you don't lose that gasket. And then from here, we can just take this front intake plastic piece off and move that out of the way. And now we finally have an area where we can actually do the work we need to remove everything. So the first thing we need to do before we remove the radiator is get some of the hoses out of the way and get the radiator fan out of the way. Get yourself a set of needle nose pliers and get ready to start removing a few hoses. These are just these little compression clamps that go over everything. So we're going to take our overflow reservoir tube and we're going to put it over to the side for just a little bit. And the next thing is this electronics control box. This is dedicated to controlling the radiator fan on your system, and because it's electronic, that's another reason why we wanted to disconnect the negative terminal from the battery. Now it's been over 90 seconds, so we should be able to safely remove this connection. Now there are some points in where this wire loom gets locked into the fan. However, it comes out relatively easily. So the first thing we're going to start off with is depressing this little piece on the radiator fan control box, and we are going to disconnect that piece. It slides off like that. Now these little connections right here more or less just pop out. Now you might find that due to the position, it's easier just to get at it with a flathead screwdriver. And we're just going to gently remove them. And there we go. The plastic is relatively malleable, so whether you just unhook the loom from the locking points or you pull out, it should be fine. And then from there, we no longer have any electronics hooked up to the fan, and we can start removing some other stuff such as the main exit portion for the radiator fluid. So we're going to use our tweezers. We are going to wiggle this connection. Now you may lose a little bit of coolant coming out of this, but considering we are replacing the radiator anyway, losing a little coolant isn't all that big of a deal. I'm going to wiggle that free. And we're just going to kind of leave this be for right now. You hear a little bit of fluid in the tube right down at the bottom, but at this point we have the tubes out of the way so that we can remove the radiator fan. This fan is held in by 1, 2, 3 bolts and 2 little knobs at the bottom that just slide into some holes. So it's relatively simple to undo. So what we're going to do is use our 10mm socket wrench and a few of our handy dandy magnetic parts trays so we don't lose anything. We're going to undo the bolts and hold the radiator fan in place. There's one. There's two. And there is three. At this point, you should be able to wiggle. Now be careful that you are not pulling on anything. But just like that, it slides up and out. And we can put this to the side. Okay, so our radiator has two types of connections. Not every vehicle is like this, but the Outlanders are. First off, we've got our transmission line connections where transmission fluid comes into the radiator to cool it off. Now, there's a few ways you can undo this. If you wanted to go from the bottom and up, there are these crimp connections on each one of these, but we're not going to go from there. There's actually an easier way to go about this, and we're just going to take this connection and this connection off of these metal parts, and we're just going to transplant those hoses onto our new radiator once we get the old one out, and that will make it a whole lot easier because now we don't have to lift the vehicle. Alright, so we need to remove the bottom part of the radiator hose right here, which this one has got the connection in a bit of a funky place. So you may need to find a tool that works for getting down and under there. So we're going to try something other than these needle nose pliers, just because the connection needs to be squeezed this way. We have very little room. Perhaps maybe a smaller set of needle nose pliers will do. At the very least, what we can do is rotate it. Now with it rotated, we should be able to get a better angle at it, perhaps with yet a different tool. There we go. Much more leverage. Now, fully expect that when you pull that hose off, radiator fluid is going to come flowing out of there. So before we do, we're just going to pull out the pepcock, which is basically your radiator drain bolt down here, and we're going to drain the radiator fluid out of the radiator first. That way the mess is a little more controllable. There we go. Actually, there's a hole in the piece of this plastic trim that the coolant is flowing out of, going directly through and into my bucket, or my draining pan. So perhaps Mitsubishi thought about this ahead of time. We're going to open up the pepcock a little bit more, let it drain a little faster. There she blows. She's coming out nice and clean. And at this point, it's kind of just a waiting game. Make sure that you get as much of it out as you can. Because we've already removed the top of this hose, you don't have any real pressure holding anything back, like no suction. So we're just going to let it drain and then go from there. So now that the coolant is basically done draining, we've got two more lines that we need to disconnect before we can start removing the radiator, and that would be the automatic transmission fluid cooling lines, which is this thing right here, this thing right here. So once again, it's one of these compression types of fittings, and we are going to be reusing them because our new radiator didn't come with any of those. So we're going to try and grip it as best we can. Because of the angle here, you can't really get in from this side, which would have been nice. Actually, I think I got a tool that would work for that. This is probably not what this tool is designed for, but whatever works, works. There we go. These 90-degree pliers seem to have done the job much easier. Once we move that out of the way, pull this out, gently wiggle the lines off of the barbed fitting. The barbed fitting goes all the way down to right here, so it's a pretty large barb, but you do not want to hurt the line. But you do also need to grab the line in order to pull it off. So we're going to kind of wiggle it as we pull in that general direction. And we got a little bit of automatic transmission fluid coming out. That's normal. Now you will need to replace any spilled transmission fluid. Hopefully you don't lose a lot. So our new radiator that I got from Amazon does in fact have some barb covers. We're going to see if these barb covers fit over those lines, just so we don't lose any fluid if we can prevent it. Yep, slips right on over, and hopefully that'll stop any excess leaking from the automatic transmission fluid cooling lines. At this point, all we really need to do is take off the main radiator hose. We're going to lose a little bit of coolant, which is totally normal because it is still got a little bit of residual in there. And then we take apart these two bolts from the system and pull it on out. Alright, so the two bolts that are connected here and over here are 12 millimeter. So we're going to break these loose. And we're going to put them in our magnetic parts tray so we don't lose them. Put it right there. Now, this rubber piece comes off, as well as this one. We're going to place these to the side for just a moment. And now, our radiator just pulls right out. Try not to spill too much, but that's how you get the radiator out. We basically just do the opposite when we're reinstalling it. Alright, so now that we got it out, what you want to do is a little bit of inspection, see what your new radiator has and what it doesn't have. So first thing to note are these little rubber dampeners that do not come with the new radiator. So we're going to stick that exactly where it's supposed to go on our new radiator. Sure they're in there. Next thing are these hoses that also did not come with our new radiator. So we're just moving this to a better position because I don't like bending over to do all that. Make sure we get each of these clamps out of the way. So once again using this nice little 90-degree angle pliers. And now we should be able to coerce each of these lines out of the way. Don't want to break the hose, so you just want to be gentle as you remove them. And there we go. Now your new radiator may or may not already come with these barbs. If they do not, you can reuse those barbs if you absolutely need to. But ours came with new barbs, and by golly, we are going to use them. So now that we got that in place, going. Take our clamp, move it back over to the position where it needs to be. Nice strong connection. Alright, now we can start on putting the new radiator back in the car. Alright, so the two little feet that go on the bottom of the radiator fit into these enormous holes right down here, and I find that it is easier to place these in the hole beforehand, lest they simply slip out and fall onto the vehicle like they've done once before. Now, take our radiator and being careful not to bend any of the fins, slide it into place and make sure we get those little protrusions into the holes that they fit into, like so. And that allows the radiator to kind of finagle about when you're driving around. Then we refit the transmission lines back where they need to go. So we're going to take this line out, shove it back where it belongs. This line out, shove that back where that belongs. Now we'll use our tool to put the clamps back where they go to ensure nothing slips off. So, much like we've done already, take a good, we went a little too far. Take a good grip. And my hands are so slippery from all this oil, but at least you know the oil is doing its thing. Put that over there. Maybe slide this one a little bit. And slide this right where it belongs, right there. Do a little tug, make sure it stays on. And now you've got the bottom portion of your radiator fitted, and we can start connecting the actual coolant lines back up. Alright, so we got to put our big old coolant line back on, and we also got to put the other big old coolant line back on, but we have to get that big old connection back where it needs to go. Same tool that I used to take it off is what I'm going to use to put it back on. I can get these jaws open just enough. There we go. Yeah, almost had it. Oh, my hands are so slippery. It's a little too far. Right there. All right, give it a little tug. It's on there. And now we can reattach our radiator mounts that just simply slide over each of these connections. Just a little rubber piece that hooks on using our 12mm socket. We're going to reattach it to the car. All right, that's one. And that's two. Give it a bit of a wiggle. Make sure it stays in place. And it does. And now we gotta take this off again to put our fan back on. Sometimes you're in a bit of a rush just to get things done, and you forget the order that things have to go in. Because we still need to put our radiator fan back in place. So, let's go and do that. Our electrical control box goes on the driver's side of the vehicle. This slips down, and you'll actually see down here there are two small holes protruding out of the bottom of the radiator. In fact, I think there might be three. I don't know if you could see that. Can you see that, cameraman? Right down there. And that corresponds to the three holes that are on the radiator fan. So much like the radiator itself, it's a matter of finagling it in place and then lining everything up. It's kind of like its own little game. There we go. Like that. And now we will take our 10mm socket and screw the fan back into place. The OEM radiator doesn't use these silly little nuts that are just dangling in these plastic connections. The OEM radiator actually has a big nut that's embedded into the plastic so it doesn't turn. So what we found we have to do is, in the direction that it's turning, get a big fat flathead and press that in between the nut and the plastic space, and hopefully that'll prevent the nut from turning, and you will be able to properly tighten down the bolt that holds in the radiator fan to the radiator. Just like this. Gotta love aftermarket parts. There's always something fun to fix. Alright, so that's nice and tight. So you can do a good wiggle. Everything should wiggle together now. And at this point, we can start hooking up the last of the connections. Now we can actually put this main radiator inlet hose back on properly, since we have the radiator fan in place. And let's just scoop that in a way that it was before. Having the little teeth or the part that you clamp down on away from here, otherwise the head of this connection might get in the way of the cap that goes on right here. Now we've got all the coolant lines hooked back up, as well as the automatic transmission fluid lines. At this point, we just need to button up a few things with the electrical connections. First thing we're going to do is put back our coolant overflow reservoir hose. Then we're going to reconnect, drag this underneath that coolant overflow reservoir hose, connect that back up there. Now these plastic connections we took out, we're going to just slip back into, and we're going to put our coolant overflow reservoir hoses in their respective connected spots. And now we are going to reattach our air intake connections. Make sure this little rubber gasket right here is in place. Just goes over the top, and it goes over a fitted connection. Goes on here. And I want to make sure. There we go. There we go. And then you'll need two plastic rivets to put where this once used to have plastic rivets. And now we can reconnect the power to the battery and start filling up our coolant. We don't want to forget this little guy right here, where it clamps on to that portion that is this air intake. And we're going to take our negative lead, hook it back up to our car, make sure it is nice and secure. On your Outlander, the moment you do this, when the power's been out, your headlights will come on, sort of as a way to confirm that power is moving through the system. Now, the last thing we need to do is fill up the radiator with new coolant and burp the system. You can do that without one of these special funnels, but I seriously recommend getting one because they're going to make your life a whole lot easier. This is a universal coolant burping kit, and you'll see it comes with a bunch of different connections that are color coded because every make and model's radiator connection is a little different. In my case, I use this little green piece, and you'll see it's got a little gasket connection on the bottom here. That's because it fits right where you would pour your coolant in. And then you've got another piece that corresponds with it, and assuming you've got the correct connection, you place it down like you would your standard radiator cap. And you give it a nice tightening to ensure that everything is secure. And now coolant isn't going to go flying out everywhere, because the bottom of this funnel goes on here. Now when you're burping the coolant, you're going to have coolant pop up and everything like little bubbles. And you may not need to use all the coolant that you have. So once you're done burping, you have this plug that you can put in the center of your funnel, and any unused coolant can be put back in the bottle that you got your coolant from and stored for use in another time. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we've just got some Prestone coolant antifreeze already pre-diluted to be a 50-50 mix, and we're going to put it in the funnel. First we open it up, and this is the green stuff, the universal coolant, which is the stuff I've already got in my engine. So first As you can see, the plug prevents any coolant from going down. We're going to fill it up here, and we're going to remove the plug, and hopefully no coolant spills out of any of the holes where the tubes are that we just did. You can see it's burping down into there. This isn't the burping process, but it is the filling process. The burping process you have to do with the engine on. So we're going to look around, make sure we don't see coolant coming out anywhere. Given the fact that we just did the radiator swap, you'll probably see coolant from that, but assuming everything else is buttoned up and connected properly, shouldn't have a problem. And I don't see any leaking coming out anywhere, so we're going to continue to fill this until it is actually more than full in the radiator, because that is what we're going to need to do for the burping process. Basically, burping is when there's air trapped in the system, we got to release the air that is trapped in the system. But for right now, we're just going to fill her up. We're going to keep filling up this tube until, or this funnel, until coolant doesn't go down anymore. And then we'll start the burping process. And dump the entire gallon in here. Because whatever we don't use, we can put away thanks to this funnel system. And now we have gotten the funnel completely full, which means the radiator itself is also full. So now we can begin the burping process. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn the vehicle on. Since we disconnected the battery, the computer needs to kind of recalibrate itself a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back over sit here and we're going to see a bunch of bubbles pop up, and that's the air that's trapped in the system being released. And this will happen once the vehicle reaches operating temperature. Okay, so once everything is done over there and the burping system is still on, what you're going to want to do is turn the heat all the way up, so that way you get coolant going through the heater core that exchanges heat with the engine to ensure that when you turn on the heat, you actually get warmness in the winter. Now, while we're also in here, what we're going to do is put our foot on the brake and our e-brake on. We're going to run through the gears here just a few times, because we want the gears to be fully lubricated. Because if you remember, we lost a little bit of automatic transmission fluid. And what we're going to do is we're going to check the dipstick for the automatic transmission fluid and make sure we still have an adequate, safe, appropriate amount of automatic transmission fluid, which is something you typically do when the engine is on and everything is at operational temperature. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what the dipstick says. Pardon? All right, so our automatic transmission fluid dipstick is right down here. We're going to pull it out. We're going to clean it up real quick, and then we're going to get a fresh reading. Push it down in there. We're going to wait a few seconds, make sure it's coated up nicely. We're going to pull it out, and I'd say we are right about where we need to be. We're going to take one more reading just to make sure, because it can be a little difficult to tell. So we've got transmission fluid going up at the very least to the bottom of the hot. Now there is hot and cold to read at different times. That being said, typically you want to test it when it's hot. Now that being said, we have not driven the vehicle yet, so the transmission may not be totally up to temperature. We are, I'd say, lower than I'd want to be for a transmission on the hot side, but we're going to have to drive it around a little bit and check again. But just know that that's something you want to keep an eye on to make sure that you're not running low on that because of the radiator swap. So like I was saying before, these universal coolant filling funnels are really handy because we dumped the whole thing, the whole gallon here of coolant. Alas, as you can see, it did not need all that coolant. So if you come over here, we're going to look directly in here. You got this little plug. This plug goes down in there. Once you get it nice and in place, you should now be able to remove the funnel and put the funnel over the hole of where you got your coolant from, in this case the jug. That was fun. And now we're draining coolant back in. Maybe don't push the plug in as hard as I did, but that's the whole idea. It's not fun working on the car unless you get a little dirty, right? Don't burn yourself. And assuming everything went the way it did with me, you should have a working radiator again. I just went for a test drive and I beat the crap out of it by putting it in manual gear selection. Just make sure to put in the last of the rivets, and I have some rivets. They're a little big so they don't really fit properly, but it holds it. And hopefully now you too feel confident enough to put a new radiator in your Outlander. Just remember, check that dipstick for the automatic transmission fluid and ensure that it is topped off to the correct amount, and you're good to go.